Okay, hey everybody, welcome back. Hope y'all are doing great. We have about 2.5 minutes until class time. So for now, I guess, just good to be with you guys, get comfortable, and we'll get this started in just a bit. Eddie, what's up? Good boy. Hey Devin, good to see you. It's Eddie, yeah, he's here. And he's really being a ham. I mean, look at this guy. Good Eddie. Yeah, he's just a real lovable kitty. Peachy, or Princess Peach. I guess full name Princess Peach, but for the most part I just call her Peach or Peachy. Hi Anthony. They're brother and sister, yeah. So this is big bro Eddie. Yeah, they're a great team. Hi Austin. No, we're actually finishing the we're finishing chapter 9 today. Hey Mateo. No problem. Hey Ian. Okay guys, so thank you so much for being here. Now we're at pretty much 12:45, so I'll start getting our meeting underway as usual. Thanks again for being here, and I hope everything's going well with your other classes as we get closer to the final dates of the semester. Everything we're doing is on track in terms of the calendar and in terms of the syllabus, but just to kind of make sure we're all keeping track of it and that we're all familiar with it. You have a meeting today where we're going to finish up chapter 9, and then the next 2 meetings after this is all going to be review sessions. I'm going to mail to you guys the study guide for the final exam after class. Well, after my 3:45 class ends. So I have 2 classes back to back at OCC, you guys, and then a 2:20 to 3:45. But anyway, when I'm done at 3:45, then I'll have a free moment and I'll mail everybody through Canvas the study guide for the upcoming final. And then we'll use 2 class periods, Thursday this week and then Tuesday next week, to just review all the topics on the study guide. And then the last thing, of course, is the final exam next Thursday. Don't forget your final homework assignment, homework number 4. That's due this week, anytime before the end of the day Friday. So you've got until midnight on Friday night. And that's the media analysis 4th homework assignment that you guys have been working on. So kind of just keeping your head in the game to remind you about what's important for the last few weeks here. You want to make sure to submit that last homework on Friday, if not before. And then you want to, attend the study guide review sessions so that you can be prepared for the exam. And then that's it. Yeah, on Sunday night, I mailed off to you guys the notification that I'm done with homework 3 and the 3rd quiz. So I'm getting back to all those that have requested the grades, not to worry. It just takes me a little bit, maybe this week I'm a little impacted because the course schedule at Orange Coast is a little different from some of the other campuses that I do work at. So for actually for all the other places that I work, they're taking their finals this week. So it's, it's finals week for these other classes, and I'm teaching a bunch. So that means that I'm constantly right now proctoring the exams, getting students their final grade reports in, and all of that. But not to worry, I'll be done with the email inbox queue that I have before the end of the night. So I'm just letting you know that if you're worried or wondering, where's your response? Not to worry, it'll be coming to you tonight within the next day here. So anyways, let me see, what have you said here, Paul? It's going to take you some epic self-discipline to do that fast homework, that last homework rather, sorry. You just got 128 gigs RAM for your second workstation. Okay, well, now you're going to just be playing video games and stuff. Yeah, you know, just take care of your business. We all have obligations, school, work, professional, personal. But this is one of them, so just try your best and turn in some solid work, whatever you can do. And as you know, I'll finish those grades well in advance before the final exam, so you can know where you stand with all the grades completed. Okay, so just a couple of introductory notes, and as usual, again, if you haven't already, go ahead and leave behind a comment anytime, and then that'll be my way of keeping track of those that have been here. So like I say, yeah, today is the last day of lecture on chapter 9, which is ethics. So I'm going to say a few brief summary points about the last couple meetings on ethics. And today we're going to have a interesting final lecture on this topic. So after today, there's no more new material, there's no more lectures. Thursday and Tuesday coming up is just review of the study guide, and then the test is next Thursday, so that won't be a lecture day either. So we're having one more last venture out into the weeds of philosophy and ethics. Okay, so back to ethics, chapter 9, that's our focus. Okay, so I'm just gonna, when will I give the extra credit? Thank you, Alina, yes. So I'm gonna actually have a very simple extra credit, but I was going to wait until after you submitted your 4th homework. Nonetheless, here's what it is. But I kind of didn't want to say it at this point, though, because I don't want to get a flood of emails coming in. But let me just sort of give you a preview, Alina, so that you know what I will intend to do. Later on this week, after you turn in the 4th homework, during the weekend, when I'm kind of rushing through grading all that stuff, I would like everybody to know what their grades are in the class. So what I'm going to simply do is tell you guys that if you send me a grade request, I'll give you 10 points of extra credit just for checking on your grades. Okay, so that's very easy for you to do, but I don't want you to do it just yet, because otherwise I'll be even more buried in emails than I already am. So I'm going to wait until this weekend. Then when you send me a grade check over the weekend, boom, you're getting 10 points for that. So that'll be my extra credit little freebie for those people that are, just at least willing to check in on their grades. So that's your answer, Alina. Hold on though until after Friday. Okay. What's up, Noah? What's your question? When you write something like you should be prepared to just tell me what's your thought in mind. Do you want something different than that? If we already sent a grade check, do we need to send another one on this weekend? Yes. Well, the thing is, Paul, not everybody is doing it in line with the directive that I'm giving. They're asking for their grades because they just want to know so far. And some people don't have a sufficient incentive to ask for their grades. Like half of the people won't do it. So I want everybody to do it, but I want them all to do it at a time and point that's a little more convenient for me to just go through them and give you a quick response. So it's a simple thing. I mean, no, I don't know. Are you disappointed? You don't want free points? I don't know. But anyway, to anybody reasonable, it's a good thing because you're going to get free points just for sending an email. But we're going to wait until after 4th homework because there's going to be another homework graded anyway, Paul. You understand that, right? No, nothing like that. But anyway, free points are nice. I don't usually do that, so I'm trying to be nice. So don't bite the hand that feeds there. I'm going to give you 10 points. It is 10 points. It's just 10 points towards your final grade. The class grade in the end is out of 1,000 points. So I mean, what? That's 1% of your class grade. So I'm giving you a free 1% out of 1,000 points, 10 of them. Okay. So I don't think there's much more to say about that, but we're all clear. You say, could I just skip 10 points from the homework? I'm sorry if I don't understand your question, Paul. Are you being a little bit unclear? I'm simply telling you I'm going to give you 10 points for sending me an email where you do a grade request after the 4th homework is submitted and after I've gone through the stack and I've graded most of them. Then at that time, I would like people to be able to request their grades so that we're all clear on where you stand heading into the final. And as a courtesy to you and as a benefit to you, I'll award you 10 points if you simply do that. No, it does not say that, Paul. The syllabus says that 10 points. Oh, well, yeah, okay, so it's 10%. 10% is different than 10 points, though. I don't know if we're talking about the same thing. 10 points is not 10%. 10% of 1,000 is 100 points. The homeworks are worth 100 points each. The class grade is out of 1,000. I'm not giving 10% of a class grade. I'm not going to give 100 points extra credit. No. So are we all clear? 10 points is 1% of 1,000 points. And I'm offering to give you 10 points to add to your grade. So for example, you know, like your previous homeworks, quizzes and things, if you got like a 40 on one of them and you're like, I would have rather had a 50, this supplements it and kind of boosts that grade up. But I mean, it's really feeding back into your total. So that's how it looks. Okay. Yes. No reference to the 1,000 points. Well, you know, if you look at the percentile value of each assignment in the syllabus, and then you look at these numbers that you're getting back when you request grades, you'll see that you got, like, let's say 100 points on an assignment. Now, do the math. If it says it's out of 100, and in the syllabus it says that it's a 10% value of your grade, then you know that 100 points at 10% value would be multiplied by 10, and therefore it's out of 1,000. But anyways, good. So let's go back into the topic of ethics. Are we clear all about this other stuff? Because, you know, now I hope we're all on the same page. But it's not that complicated. We're just finishing the class. You have one more homework assignment and a final. After you turn that homework assignment in, a student asked me about an extra credit option that I mentioned earlier, and I had something in mind. Since the question was asked, I'm replying to the question, which is how I will award the extra credit. And this extra credit will be awarded on the basis of a response given to an email request for a grade of 10 points. Okay, but each grade itself could be scaled separately, so there was no clear indicator that it was consistent across each subscore. Well, you know, I guess if you're a true mathematician or an accountant, you know, you might want to crunch the numbers differently, but I think there's a common sense way to do it, and therefore, you know, given the common sense plus just following the class, I think you'd be okay. Not to worry though. Okay, so to the questions of ethics. Yeah, I know everybody's a little stressed. No, it's all good though. You know, you're going to be fine. You're going to live through this, and when you come out on the other side, you'll be better off for it. Sometimes, what do they say? It takes pressure to create a diamond or something like that. Is this just one of those cliche phrases that's overused one-liner? Maybe, but perhaps there's a kernel of truth to that too. You'll do fine. Noah, I think you'll be good. But I feel you. I've been in your position. I've sat in that position, so not to worry. Hopefully you don't lose half your hair. Well, you know, if you do, there's solutions for that too. Buy a wig, whatever. Okay, so to the chapter 9. Ethics. I'll just review a couple of major points on it. So first of all, ethics is the theoretical study of morality. So when we talk about morality, we are talking about moral concepts such as good, bad, right, and wrong, moral and immoral, how a person ought to act versus how a person shouldn't act, and all of that. We discussed how within ethics there's a sort of standard breakdown of 3 different types of actions. There are morally obligatory actions, morally impermissible actions, and morally permissible actions, although I presented them in a different order when I first talked about them. Impermissible, permissible, obligatory. Impermissible acts are wrong. They're not okay to do morally. So, like, if you're going to kill your neighbor for fun, this is not okay. It's just wrong to do that. Among other things that could be mentioned, talked about that before. Morally permissible acts, these are acts that are not wrong. They are okay to do. So attending a lecture, reading a book, depending on the book, whichever one it is, but I would say just reading it's probably not wrong, and so on. And then, you know, morally obligatory actions that you must do, and it would be wrong not to perform them, whether that's keeping promises, whether that's payment for service, whether that's not performing any of the impermissible acts. We have a sort of range of possibilities there. And after that, we talked about a whole, you know, cluster of other moral concepts. What's moral reasoning, making decisions about what's right and wrong, what you should do. What are moral versus non-moral values? Moral values, values that benefit you and others, but they're also good for their own sake, like forgiveness, justice, compassion. Non-moral values, values that are goal-oriented, which are desired as a means to an end, and those are more like self-directed towards your pursuit of pleasure. Like some of those values include wealth, popularity, fame. We talked about the conscience, some innate source of knowledge about what's right and wrong. We talked about how the conscience alerts us to moral sentiments that we can have, which are emotions that make us want to do the right thing and reveal to us a moral scenario or situation that we are like observing. We talked about related moral sentiments, helper's high, feeling good when you help people, empathy, understanding and caring about how people feel, compassion, wanting to take actions to make people feel better or to relieve unhappiness. Moral outrage, when you perceive something that you think is wrong and then you become upset. Moral tragedy, I believe we talked about, which is when you make a bad moral decision that you regret. We talked about the difference between resentment and guilt. Guilt, a bad feeling that you have when you've done something wrong. You want to then correct the wrong or make amends. Shame, though, a bad feeling that you get from violating a social norm or some kind of convention. And therefore, it's possible to experience shame without guilt if you thought you did something that was in violation of the social expectation, but not in and of itself immoral. And we talked about examples of that. And then we talked about the development of moral reasoning in stages across one's life. That was all the work of Lawrence Kohlberg, who divided the moral development process into 3 different stages or phases. So let me just quickly review some of that with you, because that was from the Thursday meeting, most recent meeting. What are these 3 stages, if you could name them? And then maybe we can just say a few things about them as we continue this little quick review before I move on to some new material. So 3 stages of moral development. Help me if you can with the facts about any 1, 2, or 3 of those. What do you know? What's the first stage, perhaps? And then we can just go from there. Moral development, Lawrence Kohlberg, part 1, part 2, part 3. So let's just try to get that in the chat, and then we'll continue from there. So let me know. Okay, thanks, Paul. You got it. So yeah, the author talked about pre-conventional. In that way of looking at morality, morality is just about avoiding punishment. So this is like the very kind of earliest thinking that anybody has about right and wrong. Think of children or relatively unsophisticated adults that don't think much about why they're doing the things they're doing morally. They just don't want to get caught. They don't want to be held accountable or punished. And then you get the conventional stage. Good, the second one. That is when the person is all about fitting into the social norms and conventions in order to win the approval of others, to be perceived in a certain way, like as a good boy, nice girl, a productive member of society. So it flips from thinking, I only do it because of, fear of punishment, to I do it out of desire for conformity and approval. And then they get to that third post-conventional stage, if you can, according to the book anyway. I mean, there are studies, I guess, that they indicate in the footnotes, but provocative point they made that only 10% or so of American adults will make it to this third stage, post-conventional. So now the individual adopts universal moral principles, kind of like a moral code that they live by. And that set of moral principles they allow to guide them through life. And sometimes that leads them to moral conclusions that can even differ from, typo, but yeah, differ, D-I-F-F-E-R, from the rest of society. So that's where you would see people who are willing to speak out against like injustices of their time that seem to be in fashion or whatever. Sometimes there have to be people, after all, that do challenge the status quo, that are willing to make us reconsider some of our given assumptions about right and wrong. And that's why post-conventional level is mentioned there too. Now, after that, we segued into a brief discussion about different types of moral theories. And that's what's really going to consume the remainder of today's time. But let me just see if you can touch base with me on that. So there's 2 types of moral theories overall. So let's see if we can remember. There's moral something-somethingerism, and then another moral ism. But what are these 2 different systems of thought, which we call moral theories? Moral blank versus moral different other blank. So 2 types of moral theories. Let me know. Yeah, what do you think? Oh, Paul's question is perhaps bias on Kohlberg's part that a universal moral code is better than the conventional level. Well, I don't know. I guess it would be borne out in the way people actually end up behaving. He says that according to one study where you have like this measurable status of people with different moral development, they act differently in real scenarios that they're put into. Like a person is more willing to take a reasonable action that prevents against someone's death or injury, even if they thought that it would contravene like a social norm if they were at the post-conventional level. So, I mean, if you're a person that values willingness to abridge custom in order to do something that's effective at helping people, then I guess you could say there's an objective reason to prioritize and prefer the higher level of moral development. After all, too, I mean, Paul, I think we talked about this, but we'll talk about it again right now. If you're in the conventional stage, then you're probably going to fall under moral relativism. and that means that you'd be subject to whatever criticisms moral relativism is subject to. So now let's go over that, because it's a good segue into the current definition I asked you about. Moral relativism. That's the view that morality is relative. It's not universal, it's not objective. So there's not like one size fits all universal moral principles. On that view, moral relativism, what's right and wrong depends on something. Depends on what? Well, there's two different types of relativistic view. So one of them is ethical subjectivism, and another type of moral relativism is cultural relativism. So let me ask you that question. Now that we're within the topic of moral relativism, let's zoom in a little further, and I want you to just talk to me and tell me what is moral ethical subjectivism, and then what is the cultural relativist version of moral relativism. So within moral relativism, there's a subdivision: ethical subjectivism, cultural relativism. Let me hear from somebody what those two things are. Yes, ethical subjectivism versus cultural relativism. Just want to know what those two things say is the standard of right and wrong. What is right and wrong defined by according to either of those views? Now, but Paul, I can tell you're interested in the material and you've thought about it and you've read it. But to anybody else, feel free to jump in, because there is a meeting going on. So let me know. Ethical subjectivism, Paul. Morality is nothing more than each person's personal opinion. Yes. So that is like the most radically subjectivist view of morality, that there's no uniform standard, not even among people to people. There's just individual opinion, and that can differ. So this means that morality is not absolute. Far from it. It's radically subjective. It's based on the individual's view. Now, cultural relativism is also relativistic, but it places the source of morality a little different than the individual. Yeah, so cultural relativism, there you go. Well, Matteo, you say it takes into account subsections of people. Would you rather say that a little differently? What do you mean by subsections? I kind of know what you mean, but maybe we could be even more precise. So in cultural relativism, morality is defined, or it depends on what thing? So you say subsections of people. Maybe, Matteo, you could offer me just a little elaboration on the term subsections of people. What exactly do you mean? Because I think you're on the right track, but I just don't know what you mean with the word subsections. It's a very sort of technical sounding word, but I think it's a more common sense way of putting it. What do you think? So groups of individuals that share common behaviors or beliefs. There you go, right. I would have just maybe said like, societies or cultures, So good, you're right. With cultural relativism, morality depends on the norms and conventions that exist in a given culture or society, all right? So it's not based on individuals, because obviously in a society there can be deviant individuals. You know that, right? Take the case of like some weirdo, pedophile out there in our society. I think our society, and we can all probably agree, definitely frowns and looks down upon that and thinks of it as something that's evil and wrong. To the individual who's doing it, I mean, they may have a really twisted mind and they may think that this is not wrong, or, in their opinion, they have a different view. Now, on ethical subjectivism, that would be a problem, because we couldn't say, well, they're actually wrong about their view. We would just have to say, well, there's no facts here. So when they have a different opinion about whether that's good or bad to, abuse children like that, then we can't say they're wrong. We can just say that we have different views, which in many people's mind just doesn't sound like the right way to talk, because some things seem evidently wrong, no matter if there are some very weird and bizarre people that might do those things. Now, cultural relativism survives that criticism, because we don't say that because there's a few deviant people within a society that means the action is okay from the point of view of that individual's judgment. Instead, we would say that no, morality is defined by something larger than individuals. It's defined at a communal, social, cultural level. So in a culture like ours, which imposes some of the harshest penalties on this kind of conduct, we can say that exhibits the fact that our culture thinks it's wrong. So it's wrong in our culture, even if there are some individuals that may disagree. But both forms of relativism, and here's something that you really should understand, both forms of relativism, whether it's ethical subjectivism or cultural relativism, they're still subject to similar types of objection, because if you're a person who finds that there is some just reprehensible conduct that is absolutely morally forbidden, then you'll never be able to say that from either standpoint of relativism, because the most you could say would be that within a given culture that's wrong, or to a given certain individual it's wrong, which doesn't go far enough for a lot of people. Furthermore, it's kind of hard to understand the logical basis for making moral changes to a culture if cultural relativism is true. Because after all, if cultural relativism is true, then the moral status of an action does not change until culture changes. But then what would be the point of changing it? You know, so if slavery wasn't wrong until society decided that it was wrong, then maybe it should never have been abolished, because in that case, it's like the moral basis for saying it's wrong does not exist until after we've changed. But then the impetus for the change no longer seems to make any sense. Isn't it a bit more reasonable to say that there was just a sort of erroneous assessment of right and wrong that prevailed in the culture at the time, and we made moral progress from that standpoint to a better, more moral world? So anyway, I'm not saying that you do or don't have to agree with that analysis, but in fact, most philosophers that study and write about ethics are not huge fans of relativism in general, but it does have a certain kind of appeal because it seems to dovetail nicely with the idea of tolerance and diversity of opinion and stuff like that. Well, anyway, since we've talked a lot about the cultural relativism and ethical subjectivism, we're now focused today mostly on the other side, which is moral universalism, so that's what we saved for last. So here are some moral universalist theories, which offer us a different package of ideas. They don't say that morality is subjective, or that it is somehow dependent on culture or personal opinion. In moral universalism, there is a moral code. It's universal, something that can be discovered somehow, and that we should live according to that. Now, there are some religious versions of moral universalism that probably many people are aware of, because religion, I think, is, for many individuals, like a basic source of moral guidance, that we take away from our childhood and from our upbringing. So to the extent that people follow like a religious version of morality, that's moral universalism. And actually what that's called is divine command theory. So that's just one of them. I want to quickly talk about it, and then we'll move to the next. So divine command theory says morality is universal because it comes from God, and God sets the moral law. So divine command theory morality is dictated by the commands of God. So divine command theory, the name divine command comes from the idea of a divine being, God, commanding us to act or to not act in certain ways. Okay, so according to the divine command theory, morality, I guess in a way, I would say straightforward, but I should catch myself before I even say that, because I'll have to complexify this in just a minute. So like, okay, in the divine command theory, if God says it's forbidden, then that means it's morally impermissible. In the divine command theory, if God commands you to do so, then it's a moral obligation. So your obligations come from what God commands, and morally forbidden conduct comes from what God forbids, commands you to not do. So, I mean, like, take one religion that is, I would say the predominant religion in at least American society, some version of like Protestant Christianity, or just Christianity more generally. If you thought that the Bible was the word of God, then you'd look at the 10 Commandments, for example, and where it says, thou shalt not kill, lie, steal, that would be your moral charge right there. Sorry, Paul, I had been about to say that the idea of moral universalism feels like it's vulnerable to people just being dogmatic about their own beliefs, and then divine command theory sort of popped up. Well, yeah, but I mean, people do believe these things. And so, I don't want to stand here and condemn or to voice approval either way. It's just, these are moral theories. And so my job is to present to you the theoretical alternatives that have been developed and that people have studied. Divine command theory is one of them. But here's the issue, and Paul, probably you and maybe some other students here can see already the problems that are lurking with divine command theory, all right? Divine command theory suffers from a couple of issues. Number one, all right, it's not necessarily universal in the way that it's going to be adopted by people, because a fundamental stumbling block here is that the divine command theory can only have any moral force for a person who thinks that what? Like, who could the divine command theory possibly appeal to? It might appeal to a lot of people, and I guess it does, but it can't, be the moral system of everybody. Why? Paul, you say when you have two different sets of commands from God, which one is the right one? Yes, I'm going to get to that. But please let me guide us through these difficult questions, because those topics are on my mind, and that's the next thing I want to speak about. Let's go in a logical order. I first trying to expose what could be some major or fundamental objections, or at least reasons to find fault with this. One of the reasons to find fault could be this: that the divine command theory, as far as it goes, is only appealed to, is only believed by what people? For who is the divine command theory an available theory of ethics? It is only for what sorts of people? Can you say that? Religious followers, yes, Matteo. So many people believe in God. Many people believe that God is somehow a moral lawgiver. But the problem is that that's not 100% of everybody. And so, in our society, I think that religious identification is high, but there's also studies and evidence to indicate that it's on the global decline. But nonetheless, we still have a predominant, majority of people that assign themselves identify as members of various religions. But to those that don't believe in God, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, the divine command theory cannot possibly have any appeal, because if you don't think there is a God, then there's no commands that this being could give, because you have to exist to give commands. And so if God doesn't exist, then the divine command theory just kind of doesn't have any force. So anyway, that's one reason that might be seen as an objection to it, because you normally think of ethics as something for everybody, not just for some people and not others. And there are secular theories of universalist moral ethical theories of moral universalism that don't presuppose the belief in the divine or in the supernatural. So one issue is that it can't necessarily be appealing to all, but only those that are theists. Now here's another issue, and this maybe is going to speak to your point, Paul, that you're just mentioning. Even if, let's say, you believe in God, right? And I'm sure many of us do. Even if you believe in God, the divine command theory still poses difficulties. Why? Because we would have to then be able to somehow determine what these commandments are that God is giving. And to those that have studied different religious texts or scriptures, including the Bible, you would know that religious interpretation of biblical verses is sometimes complicated and confusing and even contradictory. Just to quote a few passages, right? So you know that over there it says, thou shalt not kill, right? But then in Leviticus it also says, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, or that he who blasphemeth the name of the Lord, all the congregation shall stone him to death. So there's actually divinely commanded acts of killing in the Bible. And how is this going to be made consistent with the prior commandment that one ought not to ever kill? So now we're sort of just left with our own judgments about how to interpret the scope and context for when the command is either valid or not. Furthermore, even if you think that you can sort out these questions of biblical interpretation, there's also questions of translation, because all these things were written in other languages earlier, right? And have to be translated into the language of our native tongue, which would be English for most of us here. But looking at some of the translations of Old Testament writings, it's not clear what we're supposed to interpret. The English translation for most in that biblical commandment, thou shalt not kill, sounds pretty clear and straightforward. But then looking at the Hebrew, lo tizrak, which is what it's translated from, this means that thou shalt not do murder. And people are not always clear about how to properly interpret that phrase, because murder carries with it a little bit of a different connotation. It's like wrongful killing. So is God saying that you're not allowed to kill wrongfully, but you may do so if it doesn't amount to murder? This is just a question of scriptural interpretation that's not going to be easily settled. So divisions among proper interpretation of scripture, divisions among which religion to even follow, that is an issue for divine command theory, and the fact that some people don't even believe in God in the first place. Another issue is this, and I think this is the more philosophically deep and puzzling problem for divine command theory. And this has been, I think, discussed in philosophy too. So is something wrong simply because God commands it, or does God command us to not do it because it's wrong? If the answer is the first thing, then it seems like morality is totally based on just the arbitrary whims of this all-powerful being. But if God himself is bound not to ask us to do certain things, that would just be fundamentally wrong. Then it would seem that morality has an independent meaning that's not necessarily set by God himself. So as an example of what I'm talking about, let me refer to the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. I don't know how many of you guys are aware of some of these old Bible stories from the Old Testament and parables that are contained there. But there's a story about Abraham and Isaac. So let me just say a few things about it. And if you've ever heard of this story, you can please chime in and tell me that. It'd be nice to know. But at any rate, here we go. Abraham in the Old Testament was the original person who was said to have received the covenant from God. So that's like an agreement and a deal between God and Abraham. So God says, look, if you just distribute the word that I'm trying to provide to, my children on planet Earth and spread the gospels around, then in exchange, I will establish like a safe haven in Israel for the chosen people to be free from persecution of the Egyptians. So, it's like a sort of handshake deal. You receive the promised land of Israel. I receive, you disseminating this word and being like my emissary to the chosen people. So Abraham decides to do that. And because of that, he's like kind of described as like the knight of faith, the most allegiant possible to God, right? Because he's the one that God chose to receive the covenant. Now, later on, Abraham has a child whose name is Isaac. And in the biblical story, because God knows that Abraham will do anything that he says, he tries to test Abraham's faith. So he says, hey, Abraham, I have a command for you, all right? So here's the command. You have to kill your son Isaac. I want you to take him to the top of Mount Moriah, lead him up there, and I want you to slay him on the mountain for me as an offering to me. And so this totally perplexes Abraham because on the one hand, he's thinking, okay, well, I love my son. Imagine that. You have a child. If you have a child, the last thing you'd ever want to do is to harm them, to kill them. Because, it's a part of you. It's something that you really care a lot about. So he thinks it can't be right to kill my son. That's totally messed up. But on the other hand, this is God I'm talking to, and God's the ultimate authority. So whatever he says has got to be good and right. So he's perplexed. Should I do it? Should I not do it? What does God ask me to do? But he does decide to try and follow the commandment. So he leads Isaac up to the top of this mountain, and he doesn't exactly tell him why they're going up there. He's just like, let's go up to the top. Does anybody know this story? Some people that are followers of the Bible, do you know how the story ends? Or shall I just tell you? If you don't know, just tell me that, and then I'll go ahead and let you know. 1 second while you're thinking of that, I just need to do something in a separate window really quick because I've got to send off an announcement that's timed for another group. Okay. Sorry, that was my alarm reminding me to do that, which I've now done. So good. Okay, coming back to the meeting. All right, guys, so here we go. You don't know how it ends? Okay, well, I'll just tell you how it does end. Devin, you seem to know. So they went up to make the sacrifice, and before Abraham killed him, God substituted. Yes, so God spares Isaac. And what he does is he gives a ram. Yeah, basically like a ram or a sheep, described differently in different translations. But he provides a ram, and at the last minute, so I'll say it in a more fully stated way. He's walking Isaac up there. He finally gets him up to the summit, and he's got a blade, and he's prepared to do this deed, of killing his own son, which is like a shock to Isaac. But at the last moment, God removes Isaac and replaces him with a ram, which then becomes the offering to God. And so, I guess Isaac is spared, happy ending, and Abraham was prepared to follow through, so he did display this kind of total faith. But it doesn't resolve all of the moral and philosophical questions, right? So here's like the big question that a philosopher can and does ask. Was it inevitable in the end that God had to replace Isaac with a ram? Because even as powerful and omnipotent as God is, he cannot make it the case that killing your family members is a good thing that's morally obligatory. Or was it that God could have asked Abraham to follow through? In which case, the moral obligation seems to deviate from what any of us have a common sense idea about what is right and wrong. So on the one account, God is just a conduit through which the moral action flows, and he's not the source of it. But in the other interpretation, he's the source of morality, but it could just be totally whimsical and arbitrary. So anyway, to those that find fault with divine command theory for one of these reasons or more, we have alternative options that are kind of not presupposing the belief in one or the other religion, but that are still like powerful Western developed, mainstream theories of ethics that are universalists. So I want to talk to you about the two big ones that are most discussed in the field. And that is utilitarianism, which comes from John Stuart Mill, And then after that, if we get to it, I think we'll talk about Immanuel Kant's ethical system, which is sometimes just called Kantianism. Okay, so utilitarianism. Now, utilitarianism is the theory itself, but let me tell you about the founder, or one of the big founding fathers. It's this man. His name is John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill lived from 1806 until 1873. And I'll just tell you a little bit about his biography. He was a British philosopher and a political economist. He also briefly in his life served in the British Parliament. So in addition to his academic work, he also was a member of the government, because Parliament, you may know, is like the equivalent of our United States Congress. So he was a lawmaker there. And he had a lot of different interesting views. On the one hand, he would be what we would say today is like a libertarian, meaning that he believed in limited government, and he thought that people should be given the freedom to do conduct as long as it doesn't interfere with anyone else's interests. So, for example, so-called victimless crimes, whether it would be drinking alcohol, gambling, seeking prostitution, things like this, which are within the purview of an individual to do and that don't harm other people's interests, he would have said we should give people the freedom to do those things under the law. So he would have argued for the least restrictive government that is compatible with just maintaining civil order, but no more than that. On the other hand, though, he also would have been a person that we could describe as a progressive on certain social issues. Like, he was an early advocate for women's right to vote, including at a time when women weren't allowed to vote in the United States, and the worldwide abolition of slavery. So he had an interesting mixture of views, but he's most widely known for his writings on ethics, which are known as utilitarian ethics or utilitarianism. There's a predecessor that came slightly before him in time, another big British philosopher of the 1700s and 1800s. His name was Jeremy Bentham, and some people give him the credit for being the kind of original developer of utilitarian ethics, but I find that Mill's discussion of it is a little sharper and more precise, so I kind of think of it as like Mill, but there's one historical predecessor that's also kind of in the mix, and that's Bentham. Okay, so anyway, back to utilitarianism. What does it say? Okay, well, there's a lot that we could say about the theory, but I'm going to try and just give you the basics. And what utilitarianism says is this: ethically speaking, if you want to do the right thing, here's the blueprint. So it says, act always to promote the greatest amount markers are starting to dry up at the end of the semester. Anyway, the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. For the greatest number of people. So this little principle is the whole moral framework of a utilitarian ethicist. And you say, now, Paul, Mill sounds smart. Where was he on the economy side of things? Well, given his kind of free market libertarian views, he would have been a believer in limited regulation and all that other stuff. But I mean, as we're talking about his ethics, he does say that he thought that having a maximum liberty makes people happier. So there's a connection between some of his political work and his ethical philosophy, but the connection's a little bit downstream, and they can be discussed independently of each other. But yeah, so anyway, though, to Mill and utilitarian ethics, thinking about the philosophy itself and the theory, here's what it says. Act always this way, to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So you're trying to get to the greatest amount of total happiness for the greatest number of people every time you do something. And if you do that action, that's what your moral obligation would be. So from the utilitarian framework, say you're a person that has options in front of you, and you're trying to take one of those options, but you're just not sure which one is right. Well, a utilitarian would advise you this way. They would say, consider how much total happiness would be output from each different action, and then act in accordance with whichever one would create the most overall. So you always kind of have to be engaged in these forward-looking prospective judgments about how all of your different choices could play out. That's why utilitarianism is sometimes called a member of a family of theories which are known as consequentialists. Okay, so let me add that word to the board just so that you get some more of the terminology that's used here. Utilitarianism is a member of the consequentialist school of thought. So it is a consequentialist theory. And the word consequentialist just means that the morality of an action depends on the consequences that come from doing it afterwards. The word consequence just means the results or the effects of doing something. Sometimes you hear the word consequences and you just zoom to thinking negative consequences. But there could be positive or negative consequences of an action. If I help someone study for their exam and then they do well, you might say that their good result was a consequence of me deciding to help them out. Or if I stay up all night with them, getting them drunk, and then they do really badly on their exam, you could say, well, that was a bad consequence of me depriving them from their study time and from their habits. So actions can have positive or negative consequences, some consequences that cause pain, some that cause pleasure. Utilitarians say, try to game out each action in terms of how much total happiness would generate from that, and then act towards those consequences, whichever one would give you the most. So that's the game, that's the way you're supposed to try and take actions in utilitarianism, but you might now be sitting there wondering, well, why is this universalist? Well, if they were happy to be drunk, I guess, yeah, I was only using that example to explain what consequences are, not necessarily what a utilitarian would think is better or worse. But to be real, a utilitarian would probably say that the loss of pleasure that comes from the failure of the class and the closing opportunities that that eliminates is going to be greater in total than the pleasure derived from the one instance of drinking. Because you have to think not just about the near term, but also the long-term consequences from doing something. And then, Paul, you say, I get it, but presumably with knowledge and wisdom, you'd look at the outcome from failing the class. Yeah, I mean, the outcome of failing the class is bad for you, and maybe for others too. I don't know, depending on how much support you're able to provide for people or how much people depend on you. But let me continue with the discussion here. I want to tell you about why it is that this is supposed to be plausible, because Mill doesn't just say, here's the view, just accept it. He tries to persuade. He tries to convince that this is reasonable. So he offers a couple of principles to back it up, all right? Now I'm going to write what some of these principles are here, because this is supposed to be like little, pillars of support that stand under this to support it and make it seem reasonable and strong. So one of the main underlying claims is what he calls the greatest happiness principle. Greatest happiness principle. So he's like, if you want to know why I think this is true, take a look at this principle. What the principle says is simply this. Actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse. So here's that written. Actions are right in the moral sense, morally right. Sorry. Actions are right to the extent that, meaning like to the degree that to the extent that they promote happiness. And there's a second part to the principle. And, okay, part two, and actions are wrong morally to the extent that they promote the reverse of happiness. Okay, so it just takes a minute to write it, but there you have it. Actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse of that. Okay, now, giving everybody an A is pretty utilitarian. Yeah, well, not really though, because Mateo, if you get appointed to like a higher course of education without the qualifications and skills that you need, then you might actually suffer a loss in the future when it comes time for you to call on those skills that you otherwise would have had that you didn't develop because you got free grades. But I'm sure that in the short term, yes, it would make you very happy for the A. But earning the A makes you even happier than getting it for free. You wouldn't necessarily feel some guilt thinking that you didn't acquire a merited score. I don't know. Is it a slippery slope? Perhaps. But I digress, right? Let me go into the principle one time, though. Okay, so it does say actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they promote the reverse. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, what is this word happiness that's being used? I mean, isn't that so vague, ambiguous, and it's just so nonspecific? Well, maybe to you, but to a utilitarian, happiness does have a pretty clear meaning. So let me explain to you the meaning of the two words, happiness and reverse of happiness. Okay? So happiness, first of all, in the usage of the utilitarians and their ethical system, it's just this. It's pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay? Now, since you already know that this is the greatest happiness principle, I'm going to create a little room for myself on the board, and I'll just set it off here with the GHP so that you know that's what this is. But anyway, happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain. So if that's what the definition of happiness is claimed to be, then I bet you can sort of just deduce logically using language what the definition of reverse of happiness is then. So let me see if you can attempt. If happiness equals pleasure and the absence of pain, then the reverse of happiness would mean blank and the absence of blank. Can you fill in those blanks and just see if we can state this? It's just the converse of the above definition. So instead of being pleasure in the absence of pain, here we have something in the absence of something good. So what do you think is that second definition? Correct, Paul. Pain in the absence of pleasure. Okay. So now, understand, therefore, that in the usage of utilitarian writers and ethicists, happiness just equals pleasure. It's basically equated with pleasure and the deprivation of pain. And on the opposite side, what is the reverse of happiness? What does it mean to not be happy? Well, it's to be in pain or to have pleasure taken away from you. Okay, so it's supposed to be something that's just a truism that we can recognize from our own habits and our own behavior and our own desires. You know, when people do things in life that create happiness, either for themselves, but also for others, we think of it as a good thing. So say that a person, you know, I don't know, rushed into a building, took a chance on their health and safety, but they did it because they're trying to free some people that were suffering from smoke inhalation, the building's burning, and these people need to be rescued. So a person does a heroic act, saves a life. Because this life was saved, then all of the future pleasure that otherwise would have been annihilated by the death right there can be preserved. So, you know, the pleasure that comes with graduating college or having children or traveling the world or having experiences in the future that they've never had yet. All the things that you're looking forward to doing, right? If you were to die right now, for the sake of discussion, all that pleasure would just be eliminated from the world. So in saving the one life, you prevent the loss of all that future pleasure. And on the other hand, though, if you save 2, 3, 4, it's just like that's even better on your moral record, right? So preventing pain, causing pleasure is a good thing. On the other hand, if a person sets the fire to the house, they're the arsonist, then that's a terrible thing because, you know, not only might people be hurt and physically harmed and suffering pain in the event of burning itself, but there's also the future pleasure that has been deleted that we have to consider in the equation as well. So to kill even one person and do that to them is, you know, one of the supremely wrong things that a person can do. But if you do that to 2, 3, 4, 5, if you're a serial killer, you know, your moral record is worse. I mean, numbers matter, right? I mean, it's bad, of course, for a person to do something that causes a little pain, but therefore it's even worse for them to do something that causes more and more. And on the reverse side of the spectrum, when you're doing something good that produces pleasure, takes pain away, people get a pat on the back and moral commendation for that. And the more of it they do, the better we think it is. So he thinks this rings true to our common sense, but he's going to even go further to try and defend this theory with a further principle. So I've got one more to add on the board. And then after that, I'm going to try to use the theory and apply it to a scenario so you can see how it might be used in real life. So one more piece of justification or defense for this is the idea that happiness or pleasure, since they're the same to the utilitarian, I'll just put a slash. Happiness / pleasure, pretty much same, is the only thing, he says. It's the only thing in the whole world that we pursue as an end and not as a means. So happiness or pleasure is the one and only thing that we all pursue as an end and not as a means. Gonna hold this one because I keep forgetting which one's good. As an, end and not as a means. And he says, if you understand and agree with this statement, then you're going to be even more in the utilitarian camp, because it elevates happiness and pleasure and the pursuit of it for all to the standpoint of ethics and what you should be doing morally. So why is happiness and pleasure this sort of center stage concept in this moral theory? It's because, as he argues, it's the only thing, happiness and pleasure, that we are all pursuing as an end and not as a means to something else. So for us to be clear about his point here, we have to drill into the words means and end. So I want you guys to help me make that clear. And I think that these are words that, even if we don't use them all the time in this way, you probably have heard them used like this at least a few times, and I think you have a working understanding of it somewhere in your mind. So let me try and dig that out by asking you about a phrase that some of us have heard. It's a well-known phrase. The phrase I'm talking about is the ends justify the means. If you've ever heard that statement, then maybe can you make sense of it for me and tell me in a more complete way what that actually is saying? If a person says that the ends justify the means. Okay, well, you're already onto it, Paul. Good. So an end is a goal, and the means are how you achieve the goal. You've given me the definition, but you didn't really tell me the underlying analysis of the statement that the ends justify the means. So what does it mean then? If an end is a goal and the means are how you get there, then what is claimed when one says that the ends justify the means? Because normally I would use your response to this question to determine the definition, but you've done it in the reverse order. We now know what the words means and end mean, but we haven't yet heard how they help us to interpret that truism. The ends justify the means. So please explain the meaning of that statement. It means that doing bad is justified if it has a good result. Sort of, okay? Sort of, Paul. Here's the way I would prefer to put it. The end is the goal in mind, right? It's the objective that you're trying to achieve. So say that you, I don't know, lied to your boss because you wanted to be able to be at your child's birthday party. And you got such a tough boss that if you told them the truth, then they would not let you do it. But if you say, look, I'm sick with COVID and I can't come to the office, or I don't know, that may be a bad lie. It's a little too much. But you get the point. Like if you just made up a false story so that you could avoid work, knowing that that's the only way the boss will excuse you. Now, normally you don't like lying. It sort of doesn't sit well with you to be dishonest. But in this case, maybe you're thinking, well, the ends justify the means. You know, my son's birthday is a very big deal to him, and that I care about being with him on this day for even have that memory. So because of that, I'm going to tell this little white lie. And the way I'm getting to go to the party, which is my goal, is through the means of lying. So the end is the goal, and the means are the things that you do to get there. All right? So now we can return back to this statement, and you'll understand it, I hope, a little bit better. Mill says this. He says that the reason I've created utilitarian ethics is because it seems clear to everyone already that happiness or pleasure is the one and only thing that each one of us is seeking as an end, and not as a means. So in other words, happiness or pleasure is the goal of everything. It's the goal of everything you do in life, to get happiness, to get pleasure, and nothing else is the goal. According to this way of thinking, everything else aside from pleasure is just desired, if it is, as a means to the down the line attainment of pleasure or happiness. Okay, now, if that doesn't sound immediately plausible to you, then I'll just try to make it sound more plausible by walking you through your current situation. So like right now, what are you doing? You're watching this lecture. Why are you doing this? Like, what is the reason that you're doing this? You must have some kind of goal in mind or some kind of purpose to doing this. So, you know, unless you just sleepwalked into the lecture and now you're like, what is this? Where am I? You must have had some thoughts about why. What's the point of doing this? Why are you watching this lecture? It's a means to some goal. So by watching this lecture, what goal do you think that will help you get to? And we'll take it slow, step by step. So why are you watching this lecture, though? Only you know that. I mean, so you can tell me why you're watching it. For the first time, you're like, wow, why? Why am I doing anything? I don't even know. I think you do know. Just tell me, why are you watching it? Okay, so Paul, you say you have a goal of finishing a computer science degree. And to fulfill the general ed portion, I have to select a second English course related to critical thinking. Okay, so long story short, Paul, what you're saying is probably what a lot of other students would say too. By accomplishing this class, that's a means to what goal? To, I don't know, transfer or the articulation of certain requirements, correct? So you want to transfer. Let's say that by taking this class, well, there you go, Devin. I knew that someone would try and throw me off by just saying it's pleasurable in itself. But if it is, good, done. That means that you're doing it for pleasure. But for those that don't find, the study of classes in college to necessarily be a joy by itself, we'll take a few more steps to get there, okay? So you take this lecture because you want to do well in this class. And you want to do well in this class as a means towards the larger goal of, let's say, transfer or graduation. But we're not even done yet, because why do you want to transfer, and why do you want perhaps to graduate in the end? Like, why is that a goal you have? What's the reason for that? If you want that, there must be a reason. There must be some kind of goal that's going to help you achieve, because graduation is just another means to what goal? What do you think? By graduating, what do you think that's going to help you with? Why do you want to graduate? Why don't you just drop out right now? I mean, why do you want to graduate? There must be a reason. We'll get to the money thing in a minute, Paul, but we got to go step by step. Money's a little further downstream. But for now, anyway, here's where we're at. You're attending a lecture, I can tell, and you're doing it to perhaps do well in it, on the class. And you want to do well in the class because that'll help you to graduate. But why do you want to graduate? You just like the idea of standing up there with like a, cap and gown on? Okay, well, you say, but the personal satisfaction related to the achievement of the degree outweighs the immediate amount of money I could have earned working. But again, let's focus on my question. My question is, why do you want to graduate? Isn't that simple? Can't you tell me? Why do you want to graduate? I could tell you why you want to graduate, but it's a little weird to do that. So you should just tell me why you want to graduate. You answered it, but in a kind of indirect way. You said a possible consequence is that I just told my coworker that I'll get back to him in 45 minutes so I can keep taking notes now. Right, but that's kind of a little obscure. You say the personal satisfaction related to the achievement of the degree, but you still haven't said it. I'm sure that that's not really the reason, though, Paul. Come on. If it was really just personal satisfaction, then you wouldn't care about anything that the degree could provide you with in terms of opportunities. Even if you think you're speaking to your particular case, I don't think that's the general case. Most people want to graduate and get a degree for more concrete reasons. Like what reason? Well, you, Paul, are speaking from too much of a particular point of view. And I think it's confusing our other students. Other students, why do you want to graduate? Okay, Mateo, good, because you'll have a career then. So here's the thing, though. Why do you want a career, though, Mateo? Do you just like the idea of work? You're like, put me to work. Work is what I love. I love labor. Why do you want to have a career? That's a reason. There's a reason you want the career. It's a means to something else. So what is the reason that you even want to have that career down the line that I guess you're trying to get to? If you get a career, you think that will give what as a result that you want? Because to be honest with you, I mean, it'd be better not to work, don't you think? It'd be nice to just not have to work and you could just chill. So what's the reason that you want to have to work? Because work will give you the means to what? Why do you want to work? Why do you want to work? Okay, there you go, Paul. Now you're on track. Because by working, you're going to get money. I can't believe nobody said money. I mean, isn't it obvious that, like, why am I doing this? Do you think I'm just doing, I mean, I love philosophy, but if I wasn't getting paid, no way I wouldn't do this. So you want to get a job because a job provides income and wealth. Now, why do you want income and wealth? We're almost to the very end. Okay, so, well, I guess you're kind of skipping a step, Paul, but that's fine. You say career gives money and money. Okay, let me say, money gives you what? It's a means, literally. I mean, money just is a means. It's a means to the purchasing power of goods and services and financial security. Now, why do you want to have purchasing power for goods, services, and financial security? Because that will make you happy. Exactly, Preston. And if I was to ask you one more question, why do you want happiness? Now it's okay for you to just shrug your shoulders and be like, what? I mean, what do you want from me? There's nothing I can say. It's just happiness. I mean, happiness is the goal. Now, you say, Paul, money does buy happiness. Not necessarily, but if it didn't have the ability to provide happiness, why would you want it, right? Why would you want it? Why would you want it unless you thought it could somehow serve your interests or serve your well-being? So let's take it back to the beginning, because this is real. You're in this class as a means to passing it, and you want to pass it as a means to transfer or graduation, and you want to graduate as a means, I say, to getting a job. And you want the job as a means to income, which you want as a means to the purchasing power for goods and services. And why do you want to have that power for purchasing things? Because it will make you happy and your life will be pleasant. And if you ask why you want happiness or pleasure, it's like That's just a brute fact. That's what I want, and that's what everybody wants. So happiness and pleasure seems then to be the ultimate goal of everything that you do. Why would you even get up out of bed in the morning and go to class if you didn't think that somehow it would serve your interests in terms of happiness and pleasure down the line? And some people will make a different calculation. They'll say, I think school's just a racket. There's a lot of debt involved. Maybe I won't get any gainful skills in the end. Maybe I should just focus on, hanging out with my friends, traveling, and not getting a full education, and that'll make me happy. But when people make these different decisions, they don't make them because one person cares about happiness and the other person doesn't. They're just trying to pursue them in different ways. For you, maybe happiness means like jumping out of a plane doing a skydive. For me, that's like a traumatic experience that I would hate. But, I don't disagree with you that happiness is fun and that we want happiness and pleasure. Maybe I seek it in different ways than you, but the overall objective is still there in mind. Okay, so if happiness is what I'm seeking, I'm in the pursuit of my happiness, you're in the pursuit of your happiness, and so is everyone else doing that, then that means that happiness seems to be the one and only singular objective of all human action. And that's why Mill says it's fair to put it right there at center stage of ethics, because it's what we all want. Okay, different definitions of happiness, so different ways to seek that different understanding, yes. But like when one person finds pleasure in something that you don't find pleasurable, it's not because they don't want happiness or they don't want pleasure. They just don't see pleasure the same way that you do. They don't get it from the same type of source. But we can be different, but we're unified in one sense, that we're pursuing happiness. So anyway, back to Mill. Mill with utilitarianism says, I've created an ethical theory that he thinks is universal because it's a universal fact of humans and all life, really, that we seek to pursue our own personal happiness. So happiness is the good, therefore more is better than less. Now, with that in mind, I sometimes like to show you guys like a little choice situation where utilitarian reasoning could be applied. It takes a minute to do it, and a full-blown version of it would probably occupy the full remainder of time. So I'm just going to do it on my own very fast so you get a sense. Suppose that we had this box, and this box is just going to be filled with some information. One thing I'm going to do is create, like, let's say 3 horizontal rows and then 3 vertical columns, which creates a grid of 9. And then here at the top, I'm just going to write in 3 different types of pizza topping options. So let's say P stands for pepperoni, C for cheese, M for mushroom. And now over here, I would put 3 people's names. So like, I don't know, suppose one of them's name was Paul. And one of them's name was Mateo. And then another person maybe could be Preston. Or maybe, I don't know, Devin. You've been pretty active, so let me get you in there. Now, suppose that in each box, you can see a connection between a name and a pizza topping variety. So like this box would stand for Paul, coordinated with cheese. Now in each of the boxes, I'm simply going to do this. I'm going to place into each box a different number. And the number, let's say, will be between 0 and 50, just to keep it to a standard range. And this number, what it's going to signify is the total amount of pleasure that that individual would receive if this was the pizza topping selection. So you guys, when it comes to pepperoni, cheese, and mushroom, is there any way I can get you 3 guys to help me with this, just briefly? Can you give me a rating between 0 and 50? Now, the number is supposed to stand for how much pleasure you would get, and we're all different. So if you have one that you like twice as much, you should give twice the number. Okay, so Paul, you're starting us off. You say 30 to pepperoni, 50 to cheese, 10 to mushroom. So we got 30, 50, 10. Mateo, are you still here? If you are, just call it out and let me know the three like numbers that we would have here. On the internet, I see all these young people being like 10 for 10 would recommend. Well, I'm not asking exactly that, but kind of like that out of 50, and just in terms of like the quantity of total pleasure or happiness you think that would give you. Okay, Mateo, are you with me? Let me know 3 numbers: pepperoni, cheese, mushroom. If you can fire those back at me real quick, I'll take it. And if you can't, then I'm just going to pretend that I'm Mateo, and I'm going to put the numbers up there. And while we're doing this, Devin, are you in the room? Devin, please call it out as well, because you're one of the other names on the grid. So I'm going to give you like 5-10 seconds if you have something. Okay, Devin, you say 10, 50, 0. What, no love for mushrooms, Devin? Come on, man. I'm just kidding, but I like mushrooms. Anyways, 10, 50, and then just 0. That's like no pleasure. For you, that's like eating just paper. It's like not enjoyed. Okay. Mateo, do you have anything for me? Or are you kind of dipped out for a minute? Well, yeah, no, it's fine. It's totally fair. Any anchovy lovers in the house? I mean, I guess I like some weird pizzas. But yeah, Mateo's seems not to be with us, so that's okay. Let's just say for Matteo, it's like he's a pepperoni guy, and close second runner-up to mushroom. Okay, now look, if this was just a utilitarian trying to decide which choice to make. Suppose we can't split toppings, and there's only 3 set options like that, and it's these 3 people having dinner. Knowing this information about their relative preferences, we could determine what's the morally obligatory action here according to utilitarian ethics. We simply have to do addition. So we're going to get 3 totals. At the bottom of each of these columns, you're going to see a number that stands for the total quantity of pleasure produced by each outcome. So if it was pepperoni, it would be 40, 30, 10, that's 80. 80 pleasure units, huh? Cheese, 50, 50, 20, that's at 120, so that's more. And mushroom is not generating the most pleasure here. So if you're a utilitarian, I'm putting an asterisk next to the 120 figure. Because as a utilitarian, that means that cheese is your obligation here. Why? Well, relative to this group. Because it generates more maximum utility than any of the other options that could be contrasted against it. So in this scenario here, using our terms, this action becomes morally obligatory. And these other 2, by comparison with it, are morally impermissible because they don't yield as much total pleasure. Now, is everybody going to get their favorite pizza in this situation? Not really. Matteo, hypothetically, likes pepperoni twice as much. But this is where he has to, say, take one for the team, because as a utilitarian, it's not merely the most pleasure for you, the individual, but it's the most pleasure for all affected by your actions. Okay, so if you have an action that is more in line with your preferences, but it's inconsistent with what generates more happiness for all, then the utilitarian theory would say you're supposed to set aside your most favorite outcome and select the action that generates the most total happiness. Yeah, and so Paul, you say mushrooms taste like meat, but they don't have the right texture and it sort of bothers you. Yeah, well, they're interesting things to go on a pizza. I don't necessarily eat them in everything, but Paul, the pizza providers have also done their part by allowing half mushroom to make more people happy. Yes, that's right. But in my hypothetical, I wanted to not make it too complicated because then we would have to add a whole additional set of columns and stuff. So anyway, look, this is a choice situation that's trivial. It's not life and death, war and peace. But if you were a utilitarian, you'd make all decisions by applying the same type of calculus. Say you were a legislator, right? And a bill comes before you. The bill says legalize marijuana, yay or nay. Now you're the legislator, and if you're a utilitarian-minded legislator, you would have to conceive of the 2 possible scenarios: the one in which the bill passes, the one in which the bill is defeated, and then you'd have to decide which of those 2 status quo do you think would generate more total happiness for society, given all the factors that you assess, right? And then you'd act in accordance with whatever that analysis is. Sometimes people criticize utilitarianism because it even allows for the commission of what some call necessary evils, if the alternative to the necessary evil, so-called, is even less productive of human happiness. So, as an example, dropping atomic bombs on Japan in World War II, hugely destructive of human life, like vaporizing like 100,000 people all like instantaneously. So it's very, very destructive. But you could argue, and utilitarians can and have argued, that it might have even been the moral obligation to do it, because the alternative to having dropped these atomic weapons might have been an indefinitely longer war period, necessitating even ground invasion, and it might have led to more deaths on both sides through the longer war that could have happened if we had not short-circuited it by forcing surrender through the use of the atomic bombs. So that shows that even actions that are hugely destructive of life and property can sometimes be justified according to utilitarian ethics as like necessary evils, where the alternative would be even worse. And so sometimes like tough mind military decisions and stuff can be framed in a utilitarian sense. But that's also what bothers a lot of people about it. There's no actions that are totally ruled out as long as they are a means to the achievement of the most overall utility. Now, Paul, you say this: if you're setting public policy as a utilitarian, you'd go for all society's happiness. But could you be a selfish utilitarian and only make choices for your own? Let me say a word about that, okay? Because I have a very clear answer for you, Paul. There's a different type of consequentialist theory, which is called hedonism, okay? And hedonism is different, but hedonism is like the theory that what you're talking about. Hedonism is a word, maybe you've even heard it in the pop culture, but it means that the right action is whichever action generates the most pleasure, but just to you, the individual. So if you were a hedonist, you'd break free of any group scenario where your pleasure is not going to be satisfied. So if you're Matteo the hedonist, you'd say, I'm sorry, guys, but we can't eat together because I need to get the pizza that's best for me. And if I have to compromise on that, I'm not going to be as happy. The thing about hedonism the notes, you want me to write the word, Devin? I was just saying it in passing, but it's not important really to your preparation for the final, but it's interesting to know. Hedonism is another version of consequentialist theory, but it says promote the most utility just for number one, just for you. Hedonism is not taken as seriously, though, in discussions of ethics, because to most folks, it sounds like an invitation to just live a selfish life that completely disregards everyone else except for yourself. And even though that's how many people do, in fact, live, ethics is supposed to be about how you ought to act if you're like morally enlightened, rather than how people have a tendency to act prior to any moral education or instruction at all. So yeah, Paul, to answer your question simply, hedonism is a type of consequentialist theory, but the only consequences that matter to hedonists are those that bear on my own happiness, not other people's. Well, if we're hedonists, what are we going to do? Just kill other people when we have to compromise because their pleasure doesn't matter anyway? I mean, it's kind of just a hard way to think about living an ethical life, but in some sense, it's kind of realistic because a lot of people do that. Okay, now, and you go into the further discussion about, you know, the justifiability of the atomic bombs. Okay, no problem. Well, I said to you guys that there's also another ethical theory that's worth mentioning, and it's a big one. It's kind of considered the major rival to utilitarian ethics. This comes to us from this German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. He lived from 1724 until 1804, and he's one of the big names in philosophy. He wrote on all kinds of topics: ethics, metaphysics, philosophy of mind. But he's well known for his work in ethics. He wrote a big book called Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. And he says that ethics is not about generating the most overall happiness. It's not about the consequences. Instead, he just says that it's based on, wait, you say why many people's suffering is more wrong than just one? Well, because it's more people and therefore it's more suffering. I mean, that's the case. Numbers matter. So if if a person like sets 3 people on fire, that's causing more suffering than if they just did it to 1. I mean, it's bad in itself, and it's extremely bad, but it's like worse and worse the more pleasure you take away or the more pain it causes. But back to Kant, we need to finish some things about Kant. Kant says that if you want to live the moral life, what you really should do is just follow the moral law, regardless of the consequences. Even if it makes nobody happy, you have to follow the objective moral law. And you might be wondering, well, what's the moral law and how could I know what it is? Kant thinks there is a factual, objective moral law that we can discover through reason. Okay, so the same kind of reason that allows us to determine principles of physics, to build amazing technology, to learn about mathematics, calculus, and all the rest. He thinks the same kind of source of human intuition that we call reason can be utilized to determine the principles of ethics. And he says that when we use and he's neutral on this, whether it's God-given or naturally evolved, but humans have reason for sure. When we use reason to determine morality, we will use this principle he calls the categorical imperative. So the major linchpin that hangs all of Kant's philosophy together is this principle that he calls the categorical imperative. Now, the categorical imperative, there's 2 different versions of it. The one that I think is the most important for you to understand is this kind of complex-looking version. And what it says is, you should always act so that the maxim of your action could be a universal law. Okay, so let me write that one time and I'll explain it. Act always, this marker would work, sorry about that. Act always so that your maxim could be a universal law. You know what? With the sort of it's still in there. Someone try and write it out. I look at the camera on the screen and I can see how dim or clear it is. So act always so that your maxim could be willed to be a universal law. Now, Matteo, the distinction between utilitarianism and hedonism. Well, I'm not sure actually, Paul, your guys' conversation back and forth, maybe I don't want to jump into that because it's going to take me away from this. But let me just focus on this here. Categorical imperative, the core element of Kant's moral philosophy. It says, always act so that your maxim could be willed to be a universal law. Now, a maxim is like an individual's policy of action, the policy behind what they themselves are doing. So like in my case right now, I'm teaching this lecture, and my little policy is I will provide a lecture at the time that it's scheduled according to my contract. Okay, so I live by that policy, and that's what I'm doing right now. I'm holding this lecture at the appointed time. Now, the categorical imperative says, ask yourself what it would be like if that maxim that you're acting on was upgraded to a universal law for everybody. So your maxim then gets converted into an all statement. So in my case, it would be like all professors will hold their classes at the duly scheduled times. Now, if that was a universal law, there'd be no problem with that. So it passes the bar of morality, and it's not wrong for me to do this. But actions that are wrong failed this test. And so they're bad maxims that could not be made to universal law. For example, here's one, and Kant talks about this himself. Suppose that I want to borrow money, but I have no desire to pay it back. At the same time, I know no one will give me the money unless I make a promise to pay it back. So I intend to do the following, lie about repayment just to get the money and then never pay it. So here's the maxim of the false lender. They say, I will make a false promise to repay whenever I want some extra money. Now, if that was a universal law, what would it say? That all people will lie about repayment when they request loans. But if that was the universal law, then there would no longer be any loans given, because all the lenders would know that all those that request loans are 100% of them not going to pay it back. So if that was the case, then even our liar would not be able to succeed in their lie, because it would be presumed as a lie. So what the liar really wants is for most people to pay their loans back so that their current lie will be presumed as truth and escape undetected against the background of most people keeping their promises. That's why the liar doesn't even want everyone to do what they're doing, because if that was universalized, it would make the system of lending itself disappear. It's kind of like this. Say I want to take a free ride on the subway, so I'm going to jump the turnstile. If I do that, my maxim is I will not pay when I ride the subway. But if that was the universal law, that would say all patrons will not pay when they ride the subway. But if that happened, if none paid, and that was the universal rule rather than the exception, then that would deny funding to this system and it would no longer operate. So the free rider would not even have a ride to take for free if everybody did what they are doing. And so even though it's a little technical looking, the message behind it is simple, I think. It's just saying it's only okay to do things that it would be both possible and not undesirable for all people to do alike. So when you're doing something and you're kind of creating an exception to the rule for yourself, like you're riding in the carpool lane by yourself because you're in a rush, but you know that if everybody that's driving by themselves did the same, then it would no longer function as a carpool lane, you know, that's wrong. When you, I don't know, tell a lie and you rely on the person to believe the lie, it's because you know that most people in these situations tell the truth. So if everyone lied in the same situation, your lie would not pass muster. And so that is the rule of the categorical imperative, which gives us a different standpoint than utilitarianism. Because in utilitarianism, the results are all that matter. How many people, how much happiness did you create? But with this, you have to be fidelity to rule. And even if the rule doesn't lead to the most overall happiness, you're duty bound to do it. Paul, if the maxim was I'll pay if I can afford it, then the universal law may be workable, progressive tax system, etc. Yes, much has to do with the specification of the maxim and the way it's framed. I guess you could say I will take a free ride on the subway in a situation where I'm down to my last dollar and in a situation where, you know, I'm penniless. So in that case, it doesn't speak to the general scope. But we're also not supposed to just be able to play around with the wording of the maxim so that we get the permission to do anything we want. Okay? Now, the last thing I'm going to say about ethics, and we're closing with this, is sometimes when people talk about you know, ethics and everything, they talk about rights. And in our book, they distinguish the two major categories of rights that are often referred to. So there's two types of rights. There are liberty rights and welfare rights. Okay, so first, liberty rights. What liberty rights are rights to be left alone, to pursue your legitimate interests. Okay, so that's the idea here. Rights to be left alone, not interfered with, to pursue your legitimate interests. Okay, and then let me just quickly say what the other type of right is, and that's welfare rights. Welfare rights are rights to be given things that you might be considered necessary if you're not otherwise able to provide them for yourself. Okay, so rights to be given certain essential goods if you cannot provide them for yourself. Okay, so liberty rights, right to be left alone to pursue legitimate interests. Welfare rights, rights to be provided certain basic essential goods if you can't get them on your own. So looking at those two definitions, let me just quickly ask you some little questions. If I say I have a right to a freedom of speech, which do you think that is, liberty right or welfare right? Freedom of speech. This is one of the, I guess, rights embodied in the Bill of Rights of our Constitution. So let's say which one it is. Is it a liberty right or is it a welfare right? Is it a right to be left alone to pursue legitimate interest or a right to be given something? The freedom of speech. What do you think? Just that's a question. You got two options, welfare versus liberty. Which kind of right would be the freedom of speech? Don't leave me hanging too long. We've got no time, so I just need you to tell me. It's a liberty right, right, Mateo, because it doesn't mean you're to be given anything. It means that you're not to be interfered with by the state as you freely express your views on whatever the topics may be. What if you have a right to religion, freedom of religion? That's another liberty right. Doesn't mean you're given something. It means that no one may interfere with the free exercise of your religion. On the other hand, though, what would be a right to public education or healthcare? Those would be welfare rights, because it doesn't mean, hey, I've got to stand back and not tread on you. Instead, it means that there must be some type of service established and provided to the public for those that can't on their own afford their own education or healthcare. Police services and so on could be considered a welfare right, because maybe we're not capable of providing for our own common defense unless we have something like a military or police force. And in that case, it's given to us since it's necessary to establish basic safeguards in society. So if there was a right to food and water, it'd be a welfare right. And if there's a right to own a weapon or to practice a given religion, then that would be a liberty right. And here's the last thing I'll say, really for real. The word virtue, that's a topic that's mentioned at the very end of chapter 9. And I'll put it here in the chat. So what a virtue is just a desirable character trait. And so what are some examples of virtues? They're the kind of nice qualities that people speak of, like when they're proud of their kids' moral conduct and character. They say, I'm really proud because I raised a child that is so generous, so kind, so courageous and brave. Or maybe it is that they are, patient. Or, so the cluster of positive character traits that are usually the subject of moral praise, those are called virtues. And to some people, a moral life is spent just, you should collect all the virtues. Try to be the kind person, generous person. Try to be the fair person. My only issue with the virtue theory, which was talked a lot about by the ancient Greek Aristotle, is that it lacks a little bit of specificity. Instead of saying that an action is right or wrong, we say that a person is good or bad because they either have or don't have this character trait. But how is it that we measure whether a person is generous or kind or, whatever, brave? It's a little less specific. But in virtue theory, they say that's to the good because there's a lot of nuance to this stuff, and you just have to observe the way virtuous people act and try and imitate it. But anyways, that's the end of the chapter 9 and all the notes that I have for you guys. So like I say, later today, when I'm done with my other teaching stuff, I'll be sending you the study guide for the final, and it'll contain all the topics that we want to look at on Thursday and upcoming next Tuesday before we take our exam. So I'm going to have to go for now because I'll need to set up the other stream. But thanks, everybody. Let me know that we're good to stop, and I'll be back in touch with you then on Thursday. So is that all right? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Mateo, and everybody else that's here. Hang in there, guys, and let's just have a few more meetings, and then we'll be good to go for our final test next Thursday. All right, then. Well, until then, check in with me if you need anything, and I'll be replying to emails through the week. Okay, have a good one. See you soon.